The world isn't peaceful in the new year. In fact, the closer we get to the time when the Biden administration is about to leave office, the more urgent the actions of the United States overseas become. Last month, the U.S. State Department issued an emergency announcement, advising all U.S. citizens to avoid traveling to Belarus, and asking those who are already there to leave as soon as possible. Belarus will soon hold its presidential election in 2025, and apparently, unrest is inevitable. At the same time, in another neighboring country of Russia, Georgia, the protests demanding the rejection of the election results and a new election are still escalating. The Biden administration is stepping up its layout before leaving office for two reasons. On one hand, it's trying to preserve its own foreign policy as much as possible, so that Trump won't disrupt it. On the other hand, U.S. overseas organizations are eager to demonstrate their abilities and value to the Trump administration to prevent budget cuts and staff layoffs. In Asia, the Biden administration shows a stance of firmly supporting Yoon Suk-yeol. After Yoon Suk-yeol's failure to impose emergency martial law on December 3rd, it caused a stir in both the ruling and opposition parties. His ousting seemed certain at first. However, Yoon Suk-yeol has been extremely tough. The attitude of the ruling party has reversed several times. The public opinion, which was almost unanimously against martial law at first, has suddenly become divided, showing signs of strong external interference. The reason why the Biden administration is willing to put in so much effort in this regard is that keeping the Yoon Suk-yeol government in power is equivalent to maintaining South Korea's lopsided pro-U.S. foreign policy, which is crucial for strengthening the U.S.-Japan-South Korea trilateral alliance. In the Middle East, the situation in Syria has once again become the biggest variable in the struggle for regional dominance among various forces. Whether the United States can maintain the Kurdish armed forces in Syria is the key to determining how much say it will have in the new government. All in all, stirring up trouble in Belarus, firmly supporting Yoon Suk-yeol, and maintaining the Kurds will be the three main focuses of the Biden administration before leaving office, and also the keys that will affect the global situation in the new year. In February 2024, when the outcome of the U.S. presidential election was still shrouded in mystery, profit-seeking adventurers had already started their bold plans. Among them, Stephen Lynch, a financier from Miami, had an even crazier goal. He tried to buy the paralyzed Nord Stream to gas pipeline at an extremely low price. This 1,200-kilometer-long pipeline connected Russia's vast natural gas fields to Germany and was once regarded as the economic lifeline that would support Germany's future prosperity. However, this completed pipeline had never been put into commercial operation. One of its subsidiaries of Gazprom, the owner of the pipeline, had already filed for bankruptcy in Switzerland shortly after the Russia-Ukraine conflict broke out. In September 2022, a mysterious undersea explosion blew up one of the two main lines, but the other one remained intact. The huge political risks turned this costly pipeline into worthless scrap. Nevertheless, Stephen Lynch believed he had the ability to turn things around. He had already applied to the U.S. Treasury Department, asking for permission to bid on the project if the Nord Stream 2 pipeline was auctioned off in the Swiss bankruptcy proceedings. Lynch's confidence didn't come out of nowhere. He had been doing business in Moscow for 20 years and had rich experience and a wide network of connections. In 2007, during Putin's crackdown on domestic oligarchs, Lynch, along with a group of foreign investors, helped the former Russian oil giant Yukos transfer assets and reap huge profits from it. In 2022, after the United States announced sanctions against Russia, Lynch managed to obtain permission from the Treasury Department and completed the acquisition of the Swiss subsidiary of Sberbank of Russia at an extremely low price. Now, he's planning to buy the Nord Stream 2, which is valued at tens of billions of dollars, for just a few cents. Lynch believes that once the war ends, Germany and Russia will easily put this pipeline into use again, and then it will regain its huge value. He's quite confident that he can persuade the White House to allow U.S. capital to control this pipeline and use the ownership of the pipeline as a bargaining chip in peace negotiations with Russia, thus excluding other bidders. Lynch's confidence stems from the deep friendships he has formed through his long-term investments in many high-ranking U.S. officials. In this U.S. presidential election, Lynch has poured a large amount of political cash into both parties to ensure that whoever wins the election will support his purchase of the Nord Stream 2. In an open interview, Lynch described this bid as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for the United States to control Europe's energy supply for the rest of the fossil fuel era. According to a report by the Wall Street Journal, quite a number of U.S. senators and officials from the Treasury Department and the State Department have already received briefings or notifications about Lynch's plan. Meanwhile, this also reveals that the U.S. government will soon enter the settlement phase regarding the Ukraine issue, that is, to turn the phased achievements of this conflict into capital gains. And the closer it gets to the settlement phase, the more it has to try to expand its advantages. Because in the following negotiation process, to To make Russia give up more interests, such as the ownership of the Nord Stream pipeline, more bargaining chips need to be created. However, as Ukraine is losing its strength on the front line, opening up a new front has become a top priority. As another important neighbor of Russia, Belarus naturally becomes the best choice. Coincidentally, 2025 is the election year in Belarus, and supporting opposition protests is a common tactic of U.S. overseas agencies. Now that the conflict has entered the settlement phase, stirring up the situation in Belarus has even more special significance. Its outcome will affect how much key strategic interests, like the control of the Nord Stream pipeline, Russia and Europe are willing to cede to the United States. Once successful, the United States can use a small amount of capital to leverage huge capital gains. It's a highly profitable deal that will undoubtedly make the relevant organizations work even harder. Therefore, the situation in Belarus will become an important focus of the U.S. government's efforts in Eastern Europe. The focus of the Biden administration is to maintain the hard-won U.S.-Japan-South Korea trilateral relationship, and the key lies in South Korea. Many people know that Yoon Suk-yeol is an extremely pro-U.S. South Korean president, but people still generally underestimate the extent of U.S. support for him. In April 2024, Kurt Campbell, the U.S. Deputy Secretary of State, said in an interview that Yoon Suk-yeol deserved the Nobel Peace Prize because he put aside the differences between South Korea and Japan and strengthened the U.S.-Japan-South Korea trilateral alliance. In the U.S. strategy towards China, the U.S.-Japan-South Korea trilateral alliance is a qualitative breakthrough compared to bilateral alliances like the U.S.-Japan alliance and the U.S.-South Korea alliance. It has also been a long-term goal of the United States in the Asia-Pacific region since the Obama administration. Without Yoon Suk-yeol, this goal wouldn't have been achieved so quickly and with such high quality during the Biden administration. Before the trilateral alliance was formed, both the Japanese and South Korean governments could use their historical disputes with each other as excuses to resist U.S. pressure and delay the implementation of radical policies that could easily anger China. This excuse completely failed with Yoon Suk-yeol. Nobody could have imagined that Yoon Suk-yeol would be willing to accept all the harsh conditions from the Japanese side. This attitude angered a large number of South Koreans. They couldn't forget the crimes committed by Japan during the war, such as the comfort women and forced labor issues, and the long-term refusal of Japan's ruling party to admit and apologize for the country's crimes. According to Yoon Suk-yeol's agreement, Japan no longer needs to apologize, and all compensation costs for the victims will be borne by South Korea. The content of this agreement is simply insulting, but Yoon Suk-yeol accepted it all, clearing the way for the subsequent U.S.-Japan-South Korea trilateral summit. In the eyes of the United States, Yoon Suk-yeol, despite being a controversial president, can be regarded as a statesman who understands the bigger picture and endures humiliation. Without him, the Asia-Pacific strategy of the Biden administration would seem to achieve nothing. Therefore, even if Yoon Suk-yeol has committed unforgivable mistakes, as long as his presidency can be preserved, it will send a strong signal to the pro-US faction within South Korea, ensuring that South Korea continues along its current foreign policy path. That's why we've seen such a strange development regarding Yoon Suk-yeol's attempt to impose martial law. After the failure of martial law, all of Yoon Suk-yeol's senior aides, including the chief of staff, and the officials involved have resigned. Han Dong-wook, the then head of the ruling party, once announced that he would impeach the president together with the opposition party. Judging from the situation at that time, Yoon Suk-yeol's ousting seemed almost certain. However, things took a turn later. The stance of the ruling party reversed several times. Yoon Suk-yeol also took an extremely tough stance to resist the investigation. Even pro-Yoon Suk-yeol demonstrators began to appear on the streets of Seoul. The initial statement from the United States was rather ambiguous. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken only welcomed Yoon Suk-yeol's statement on revoking the emergency martial law order, but didn't define the Martial Law Act itself. As time passed, the U.S. stance became clear. On December 11th, Jack Reed, the chairman of the U.S. Senate Armed Services Committee, said in an interview that Yoon Suk-yeol's foreign policy had strengthened South Korea's ability to counter threats in the Pacific region. On December 21st, Secretary of State Antony Blinken had a phone call with South Korean Foreign Minister Cho Tae-yul, emphasizing that maintaining political stability was the top priority. Then, the South Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued a statement saying that an agreement had been reached with the United States to regularly consult on how to protect the ROK-US alliance during this political turmoil. These actions indicate that the United States has been deeply involved in the follow-up of the whole event and has adopted a wait-and-see strategy. Once the excitement of the South Korean people in the early stage of the martial law incident dissipates, the political forces at the top can regain the dominant position. For the United States, the best outcome would be for the Supreme Court to reject the impeachment case and keep Yoon Suk-yeol in office, or for a politician acceptable to the U.S. government to come to power and continue Yoon Suk-yeol's foreign policy to ensure the continued development of the U.S.-Japan-South Korea trilateral alliance. Of course, The biggest variable is whether the newly elected US President, Trump, will be interested in continuing this strategy, and how much resources he will be willing to invest to keep Yoon Suk-yeol or his successor in power. When some groups on the internet were cheering for the fall of the Assad regime in Syria, the decision-makers in the White House were actually not happy. The main force of the United States in Syria is the Kurdish Armed Forces, the Syrian Democratic Forces. Although the Assad regime and the Kurdish forces are hostile to each other, they have formed a relatively stable relationship in recent years. Assad has reluctantly acquiesced in the Kurds' control of the northeastern region rich in grain and oil production. The Kurds also agreed that the Assad regime and its foreign allies could control the key transportation hubs within their territory, such as the Kamishli airport and the nearby border crossings with Turkey. The situation in Syria is extremely complex. Although the contradiction between the Assad regime and the US-supported Kurdish armed forces is significant, Erdogan and the pro-Turkish armed forces he supports hate the Kurds even more. The Kurdish armed forces in Syria have close ties with the Kurdistan Workers' Party in Turkey. Turkey regards the Syrian Kurdish armed forces as a terrorist entity and aims to completely destroy this organization. Previously, the forces of the United States, Iran, Russia, Turkey, and the Assad regime had formed a tacit balance. To maintain this balance, sometimes Russian and Turkish troops would conduct joint patrols to combat the Kurdish armed forces. Sometimes, the troops of the Assad regime, Russia, and the Kurds would also organize joint patrols to prevent the expansion of Turkish forces in Syria. However, the fall of the Assad regime and the withdrawal of Russia and Iran have broken this delicate balance. The Turkish-affiliated armed forces and the Kurdish armed forces in Syria have become the main competitors. In the past month, there have been several fierce exchanges of fire between them. The Syrian National Army, supported by Turkey, is currently launching an offensive against the Kurdish-controlled areas. Apart from Turkey's determination to wipe out the Kurds, for the new Syrian government to maintain its long-term rule, it must also regain the grain and oil production areas in the northeastern region. Ahmad al-Sarraj, the leader of the Syrian new government supported by Turkey, has clearly stated that all forces, including the Kurdish armed forces, should be incorporated into the unified Syrian army. However, the Kurdish armed forces obviously won't hand over their weapons easily. For a long time, with the support of the United States, the Kurds have been hoping to establish a highly autonomous government in northeastern Syria or even jointly establish an independent country with the Kurds in Turkey. But unlike northern Iraq, although northeastern Syria is a Kurdish-inhabited area, most of the population there is not Kurdish but Sunni Arabs. Just as many people criticize the Assad regime for being ruled by the minority Alawites over the majority Sunni population, the independent government that the Kurds are seeking to establish in the northeast is also a structure where the minority rules the majority. Since the fall of the Assad regime on December 8th, some Arab residents in cities like Deir ez-Zor and Raqqa, which are controlled by the Kurdish armed forces, have been protesting against Kurdish rule. The United States and the Kurdish armed forces it supports had previously used the pretext of resisting Assad's rule to carve out a territory in Syria. Now that Assad is gone, they have lost an important excuse. The Arabs in northeastern Syria have every reason to demand to return to the jurisdiction of Damascus. Under such circumstances, the Kurdish armed forces also have to show a positive attitude. On December 30th, 2024, the Kurdish armed forces sent senior officials to Damascus to negotiate with the new Syrian government. Although both sides described this conversation as positive and constructive, their troops were still fighting on the front line while the negotiation was going on. Obviously, sending negotiators is just a gesture. The contradiction between Turkey and the Kurds is irreconcilable. Eventually, they still have to fight on the battlefield to gain bargaining chips for negotiations. And Syria's position in the Middle East is very important. It's the focus of competition among various forces such as Israel, the Sunni faction, the Shia faction, and Turkey. How much support the United States can increase for the Kurds will be the key to determining how much say it will have in the new Syrian government, and will also determine Israel's future living environment. And no matter how much the White House decides to invest in Syria, it will weaken the US's military projection capabilities in other regions.